Okay, thank you very much for having me. I'm glad to be able to say that actually in the end, I guess Jonas and I will come out on very similar comments, although I'll probably give the whole thing a bit more positive note than when you come from a country with very bad experience of a reform that apparently goes in this direction. But I do have to start a little bit with giving a couple of things as a motivation before then really trying to get into the general view of governance and the general view of finance, and that's kind of what I was asked to do here. I can only applaud you for doing this, for having a growth commission and thinking about ideas to promote the long-run performance of our economies, because I guess that's really what got lost quite a bit in many, many countries because of all the crises that we have. But ultimately, that's what it's really all about, is like laying the foundations for long-run growth. And so I do want to say that talking about education in this area is the most important thing, and I quickly want to motivate that, and therefore it's very important to really think about the school system. So if you think about what is the relation between educational achievement and economic growth, we have done some research on that that I just have to show first. If you go for the very long-run view and think about how the growth rate in GDP per capita between 1960 and 2000, or actually you can extend that to 2009, and looks exactly the same. And what countries that have grown fast have done differently than countries that have not. And if you, after accounting for the fact that they start out with different initial levels, if you relate that to the average student's scores on achievement tests between the 1960s and 1990s, so basically the PISA predecessor test. Like in the 1960s, countries have started to do some international achievement tests on math and science, and we have just tried to put all these tests on a common scale and put them into one simple measure of average student achievement, and that's what the horizontal axis here. If you scatter these two against each other, you see that basically countries just fall on this one line. You can basically, with this simple model, explain 3/4 of the difference in long-run economic growth of different countries. And once you do that, it's extremely robust, and we've done lots of additional, methodologically more sincere ways of trying to get at causality here, and we've come to be convinced that actually most of what we see here is really something like that is a causal effect of the knowledge of the population on economic growth. But it's not just sitting in school. If you would additionally, if you instead have a measure of education that's just the average years of schooling of the population, that's also positive, but it explains only 1/4 of the cross-country growth differences. And as soon as you account for what students actually know, it has no additional effect. So what is really important, of course, is schooling, but only to the extent that students learn something. Like the stuff that you have in your head afterwards is what makes economies grow in the long run. And I had to give this second slide picture as well because it's so devastating for your country, unfortunately, but also because we learned quite a bit. If you think about, let's take out all the level differences that exist between countries, because of course they may be correlated with lots of things. So one way to get at a bit more causality type of ideas is just do the difference, the change over time in economic growth and the change over time in test scores across countries. And there's only a limited number of countries that really have participated since at least the early 70s, and you can go for a long run difference. You see that actually your countries and mine are actually down here in terms of actually not having a very positive change on this number over time, whereas in here other countries have been doing better. Actually, Sweden initially had been doing better. We stopped here in 2000, which is when actually at the end things apparently really went down big time since then. And what you basically see is that the countries that have improved test scores also have improved growth performance, and the other way around. And Italy and Germany are examples of countries that really have to be worried about their trends. So the bottom line here is that actually if you think about what are the most important things for economic growth, education in the terms of educational outcomes, have to come in big time here. And actually, well, let me skip that, but actually, probably that's historically just as true as it is today. We've done some projection of what basically this means for economic outcome, just to give like a feeling of how big these long-run effects are compared to anything you can do about your business cycle. So basically, you can use the available estimates of these growth models to simulate how the future GDP of different countries would evolve if you actually manage to improve your schools. And so for the next 10 years, nothing much happened because students are still in school and they enter the labor market, but only a little fraction of the labor market. So there are no short-run benefits, no big short-run benefits. But in the long run, does it matter or does it not matter? So we've kind of modeled different ideas. So one idea would just be to make each country as good as Finland on this PISA test, just as one idea. And if you look at Italy in here, it's hardly visible, but the just point is like these are all the countries participating in the last PISA test in 2009. And these are the countries that are significantly below OECD average. These are above, and these are in the middle. So Italy's around here, somewhat quite a bit below OECD average. So there's actually quite some way to go to Finland, which is up here actually on the latest scale. And if you just use the historical evidence on how test scores are related to economic growth and project that in the future, and then just take the discounted value of all future benefits of a reform that would gradually actually improve student achievement, it turns out that Italy is actually the country that is most to gain from such a reform, both because they are relatively far down and because they are large, basically. So it's like these, like kind of, it's just like kind of giving some numbers to what it really means to improve your schools. It would, in the long run, improve like the gain of this over the long run, which is projected over the life expectancy of a child born today, which is really for 80 years, so it's a long time. It's like 17,000 billion euros for Italy. This is just, I mean, even if you believe that the effect is just half as large, it doesn't matter, actually. These are huge. And these are, I mean, in particular in Italy, if you like relate that to the projected GDP over this time, it's like a quarter increase in GDP. It's like your country is like probably the biggest gainer, like, or close to the biggest gainer on these terms for any of this. So then the most obvious thing that you would actually say is like put more money into the problem, because like we have to improve schools, right? And the bad news here is that's probably not what's going to help. If you just do a scatter plot of the PISA test score against the aggregate expenditure per student in a purchasing power parity way that went into each student until he or she is 15-year-old when they are tested on PISA, you just plot that against each other. It's just like one big cloud, but no association. And if anything, Italy is actually spending reasonably well. It's just not getting much out of it. So the idea is just like improve spending and hope that you're getting better is probably not going to work if you don't do anything else differently.
Overall spending or factors?
Overall spending, total spending. You can do it, I mean, there's, of course, lots of problems with this here, but I mean, you can put the data in all sorts of dimensions. You hardly see any big gains from just improving inputs. Like one dimension of this is class size, which is even more easily comparable across countries. You don't have to think about like how to translate currencies. Italy has relatively small class sizes compared to other countries. It's just not doing better, and again, there's no association.
How much can spend with children, each child from 6 up to 15?
Exactly, that's exactly what it is. That's what the OECD tries to calculate for each country. And there are issues with this, but that's actually why I also like to look at class size, which is one of the big ingredients into spending. It really like more than 70% in each country is teacher spending, and most of that variation comes from differences in class size. And that's probably not the wisest investment per se. So what's probably much more important, and here that I don't have to repeat what Jonas like ended up on, is teacher quality. So you have to get the best people into the classroom to teach there, but that, again, that's easier said than done. And evidence shows that actually how good a teacher really is in terms of getting more knowledge into the from the kids is hardly correlated with like their initial education. Like in the US, having a BA or an MA is not at all correlated with whether they are good teachers or not. It's hardly correlated with experience, except for maybe the first 1 or 2 years in school, and with hardly anything else you can think of, not even the quality of their college, for example. So that again is hard. So I think what we learn from that is we have to focus on that, and if we have got, in particular, very good ideas of how to persuade the very worst teachers to leave the schools because this is such an important thing for our future that actually they can rather be applied somewhere else than in schooling because that's so important, has so long-run effects, is again not very easy. So probably the best things to think about these is about indirect ways, and that's how, I mean, I like to think about this in terms of incentives that people face, and these incentives are often like formed by the institutional framework that a school, that the schools face, and therefore actually I like this general emphasis of being asked to talk about governance here and about finance, because that's exactly what determines incentives. So incentives, so the best way to use investments in a way that really gets you better outcomes is to ensure that everyone in the system, that means teachers, parents, students themselves, principals, anyone else, has incentives to focus on improving student outcomes. I mean, that's a very simple sentence, but that's actually what it all boils down to in the end. It's very hard to say exactly what you can do there, but there's quite a few lessons, I think, where you can get. The point is that in many of our school systems, basically people don't have any incentive to make sure that students really learn something. And I would actually say that Sweden is a particularly good example of that, where no one has ever even observed how your students do relative to the students in the school next door. No one even has provided any information on that. So if you really work hard as a teacher to improve what your kids are learning, no one will ever know. Meaning there is no incentive in that sense, apart from your intrinsic incentives that most teachers have, but apart from that, there is no incentive to really work on that. And so there's quite some evidence that the institutional framework does determine the incentive streams that can create better or worse student outcomes. And 3 elements of that I quickly want to talk about is autonomy. We talked a lot about that, about accountability. I think the main, at least in my simple view of the world, maybe the main reason why Sweden didn't work at all, the reform, is that there was no form of accountability whatsoever for student outcomes. And I do want to talk a little bit about choice and competition. Now, because actually we were asked to talk about autonomous schools and how that works, I want to show the first thing of a recent study we've done on how school autonomy affects student test scores. So school autonomy meaning whether the schools are allowed to decide themselves on certain curricular measures, on certain personnel measures, on certain budgetary measures. It's actually relatively similar for these different measures. And you actually, in the PISA studies, you can actually observe that because the principals are asked to, who has the main decision-making power in these different areas. And you want to see how that relates to student outcomes and to try to get closer to something like the actual causal effect of autonomy on student outcomes. What we did is pool all the different PISA tests from 2000 to 2009, do it at the individual student level so you can account for all observed differences, but then put in even country-fixed effects, meaning you just identify from variations in average autonomy over time in a country. So basically autonomy reforms that some countries actually increased autonomy and others decreased autonomy. We want to see whether these changes go hand in hand with changes in performance. And they do, but in a very heterogeneous way. Namely, change, increased autonomy over time led to improvements in student outcomes for countries with high initial GDP per capita or high development levels, or you could actually also put on here, which is like another dimension, high initial levels of PISA performance. But in countries, like in relatively poor countries or relatively countries with very poor initial performance, autonomy even had negative effects. So autonomy is not per se the big thing that will lead to improvements in outcomes. It needs to be accompanied by something else that makes countries work relatively well. In dysfunctional countries, it wouldn't work. And in particular, and I want to talk much more about that in a minute because that's easier thought about, you can see that the effects are much stronger in countries that have some sorts of accountability, in particular in this case, whether they have external exit exams at the end of high school or not. So whether there is some central monitoring in the sense that it's just like somebody at the end of the day tests whether students have learned something or not.
I can interpret also that. Say for Brazil, if you reduce autonomy,
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's actually what happened for like Brazil is a good example for that, and Mexico as well. They actually reduced autonomy over time and improved test scores. Exactly. That's exactly what it is.
You have country fixed effects. So how can you explain Sweden up there? Like what we just heard?
Because actually it's kind of funny, because what we're observing is 2000 to 2009, over that time actually, that's after the main autonomy reforms, that actually during that time, at least in the second half of it, you already see some reduction in autonomy. It's a backlash against the initial reforms. And that's basically what you see there. So people in Sweden kind of told me that, okay, that actually fits in here reasonably well, but actually it misses the point of the bigger point that actually happened beforehand, which is probably true. Now, what we see in here, what I just indicated, and I want to put more flesh on it and give you a more simple picture of that because it's easier to put in. So what I'm going to show you is just cross-sectional evidence, although this country fixed effects evidence gives us the same result, is that the effect of school autonomy correlates strongly with whether there are central exams in the country or not. And central exams just mean, I view it as one form of accountability. So basically what it does, it provides information on what students have learned at the end of the day. And I think that's one of the very important ingredients of any functioning, well-functioning school system. Because, I mean, thinking back of, like, I don't have to repeat all these things, what Jonas said of how markets can go totally wrong. I mean, one of the things we've learned is that for markets to function, you need information. I mean, this is the whole problem. Like markets with little information usually don't work very well. And I interpret these things about external exams as something that actually does increase somewhat the informational content that is available to parents and to principals, to administrators, to everyone in the system. So now, if you just take student outcomes in one of these international tests, you can have several. I mean, that's been done on several tests actually, and getting exactly the same type of results. And you ask whether the specific school that a student is in has autonomy on something. Here, like just on some parts of teacher salaries, but you can do that with other things as well. And it's just a yes/no question at the school level. You know that from the principals. And the other dimension, I want to look at whether a specific country has central exit exams, yes or no. And then first, regress this at the individual student level on all measures we have on student family background, on migration background, on parental education, on the class sizes in the schools, on teacher education, and like 40 to 50 variables that you want to put in there. Of course, it's never, I mean, it's still not randomly assigned, but at least you can get somewhat observationally equivalent students. And what you see is that actually in systems where there are no central exams, students perform better, like on the vertical axis, I know just put in the TIMSS outcomes relative to one another, so relative to the lowest category here. You see that actually students do better if the schools don't have autonomy. The interesting thing now is what happens when there are central exams. The one thing is on average student performance is much higher in these countries, and you see that again and again. You see that also within countries. Germany is a nice example where until 5 years ago, half and half of the German states had central exams or not. You see exactly the same picture, like big time differences. The second thing which is very interesting to observe is that the association of autonomy with outcomes turns around from a very strong and significant negative association to a strong and significant positive association. And how I like to interpret this picture is, if you hold schools accountable for what, at the end of the day, students have learned, then they know best on how to use their autonomy, and it works. But if you don't do that, they use their autonomy for anything, but not for student outcomes, because that's not what anybody even looks at, or can look at. Parents can't even look at it because they don't know. So, I mean, I actually don't have to repeat these things. So I guess what the basic point here is that there are countervailing effects of autonomy. So here, I'm talking about autonomy here. There are two countervailing effects. So autonomy has like theoretically, if you will, a positive effect in the sense that usually these local decision makers have better local knowledge and actually so could do the better job. They will do better than any central planner, actually. They will know best which are the right teachers to hire for their schools or how to use their budget and so on. The problem is a very, very simple principal-agent problem. If you think about a principal-agent model, if schools or local decision makers had the same interest as any principal, say like the government or maybe even the parents, and if this principal had the same information than the local schools, that wouldn't be any problem. But the point is that these two things are usually not given in schools. The first thing is no one ever really observed what's going on in school, basically. I mean, I don't even know what teachers are doing when my kids are sitting in the classroom there. And that's just like an endogenous feature of schooling, I guess. And you don't really get around that. But then as soon as there's like, if you go into decision-making areas where schools have very different interests than just furthering student outcomes, you get opportunistic behavior, so they pursue other goals than student achievement without being observed. And so that conflicts with maintaining generally high standards in the system. I guess that's much more important, for example, for things like personnel decisions or these things where you can easily think about diverging interests, whereas like there are some decision-making areas like which textbooks to be used. Probably schools don't have strong incentives to use bad textbooks. So that's actually something where you probably don't get into these problems at all, and autonomy would work. So there, you actually have to think about different dimensions of decision-making here as well. Now, oops, I'm missing one slide here. I was to talk about accountability. Well, I just have to do it from the back of my head. There's some slide missing. The thing about accountability or central exams here, what they do is they break the asymmetric information to some extent. So that's the kind of idea I have in mind. So as soon as you put in that information, it's not as easy for the local providers to behave opportunistically, and then this combination of information / accountability on the one hand and autonomy can actually work. There's other ways to improve accountability. Like you can have principals monitor teachers' lessons once in a while. You can have external inspectorates monitor teachers' lessons once in a while. You do see positive correlations of these things with student outcomes as well. Or you can like just use information to compare schools to other schools in the region or in the national system. Again, you do see positive associations. So central exams is not the only way of including accountability, but part of the thing that I like about them is the problem we see with lots of other features like putting high stakes to individual teachers is you get these big gamings and all sorts of problems in defining outcomes, whereas if we once sit down and decide on what students at the end of school should have been learning, and if you measure that, I mean, students cannot run away from themselves, so you cannot game that by like putting in another student or something. So these stakes basically go to the individual student. That has quite some features that is not as easily done if you put high stakes to individual teachers, but at the same time creates incentives. Now, one final thing I want to talk about, and I'm doing actually fine in terms of timing, now is the funding side. But that relates to this whole idea of choice and competition that we've already talked about quite a bit as well. So if you again go at this cross-country pictures and now look at two different dimensions, that's what I want to show here. So the one thing is the share of privately operated schools in the system. So there's two things I want to point out. There's a difference between private operation and autonomy. So these are usually correlated. So usually non-government schools are more autonomous than government schools, but it's not obvious that that's the case. Actually, you can have systems where public schools have lots of autonomy on deciding on which teachers to hire or other things. Or you can have like a private school system where actually the local schools cannot decide much. That all exists actually. So these are two different dimensions to think about. And the other thing to distinguish now is, if you think about private schools, is the operational side and the funding side. And that's actually what I do here. Here's like who runs the schools, who has ultimate management responsibility for a school. Is it a public entity or a non-public entity? And actually, whenever there's private here, you should actually put in non-public, because private, that includes all NGOs, non-government organizations. It could include churches, actually, quite often it does. And these type of, the main point is there's some alternative relative to the standard public school that you go to. And here is just the share of funding that a school receives that comes from government sources as opposed to non-government sources again. So the non-government sources would usually be student fees and other private contributions. And what you see here is kind of the variation you see across countries between the 10th and the 90th percentile. Kind of that's what I think I plotted up here. So most countries, a majority of countries have very few privately operated schools. Actually, Sweden is part of it still. I think it goes something like below 10%. And there are other countries that have huge shares, like 60 to 70%. And government funding share for most countries is close to 100%, but actually there are quite a few countries where it goes down to like 2/3, and 1/3 actually has to come from private sources. Now, the same thing, you cut out any other observed individual student things, and then look at how the different types of school systems perform relative to one another. The important thing to note here is it's not individual private operation of schools, it's the share of privately operated schools in a country. Two things why that is. The first thing, I mean, you'll never get around the big problem of selection into private versus public schools within a country. It's just never random who goes to the private schools. And actually, in most countries, it will be positively selected. There are countries where it may actually be the other way around. If they have lower standards, and it's easier to get a certificate here. I've heard these stories about some Italian private schools. That's the one point. But the other point is, if you really think about competition, that what these schools do is provide alternatives to parents, then you would actually expect from a very simple economic model that you increase the performance of other schools as well, because the other schools would go out of the market if they wouldn't. So basically, the whole hope of such a system would be that you have more alternatives to parents that actually affect the public schools in the area as well. So basically, I just want to look at whether the average achievement of all schools changed or not. And so if there's selection between the two sectors, that's kind of like cancels out at the country level. That's what we see here. What I show you again is correlational. Actually, we have a paper where we use some historical instruments to look at these things that come out in exactly the same way. So I have some confidence that the story I'm telling you has some causal explanation to it. What you see here, now if you plot it up, the first thing is, if you go left to right, actually independent of where you are in here, you see strong positive relation of the share of non-government schools in terms of management and student outcomes. And at the same time, if you go front to back, again, actually independent of this here, you do better if there's more government funding. So it's very important to distinguish funding side from management side. Public funding appears to be good even for the level of outcomes here, whereas government operation seems to be very bad for outcomes. That's the left-hand side. So how I like to interpret this, of course, I mean, you can think about other interpretations, I guess. How I like to interpret this is the idea that with alternative providers, parents get a choice, and actually even with more government funding, more families actually have a choice because it doesn't depend on their pockets on which schools they can attend. So that it actually does improve the average performance of a system. And indeed, actually, what you see is in countries with larger shares of privately operated schools, students in public schools perform better than students in public schools in countries where all schools are public schools, basically. So you can actually have the outcome simply for the private schools, public school students, and you would see actually that students public schools do better if there's competition. That's that's the basic idea. So the prototype of this year, like the world of combining public funding with a large share of non-government operated schools, would be the Netherlands, at least in my view. It's a standard feature there. Actually, 3/4 of students in the Netherlands go in schools that are not run by the government, but they all receive exactly the same type of funding, because it's actually written in the constitution that, in that sense, actually similar to the Swedish reform, that everybody can basically set up a school and gets, like, when students decide to go there, they get the funding for it. And in such a situation, where basically parents have a choice between different types of schools, and the schools know that, and there's competition among schools actually to deliver on outcomes. At the same time, then the Netherlands have this very well-known centralized exit exams that are even published once a year. So people have an idea of how good schools are, at least, I mean, in a vague sense in terms of what students learn there. The final picture, how does this relate to equity of outcomes? And I think that's very important, and I guess rightly so, the main concern about private involvement in the school system. So let's look at the same type of picture, where I now here distinguish between kids that have high socioeconomic status and low socioeconomic status. That's just like some combined measure of family background. That's actually I just take from the OECD. And at the funding side, now what appears to be very relevant here is basically the extent to which the government levels the playing field between schools that are publicly operated and schools that are non-publicly operated. In the sense of what I just said, that in the Netherlands, the public money goes to any school independent of whether it's a publicly operated schools or non-publicly operated schools. So basically the non-publicly operated schools get the same type of funding, and so they compete on the same grounds basically. Kind of the opposite thing here is, just as an example here, it's just run again on these some 40 countries for which we have these data, and basically I show you the coefficients of it. But underlying here as an example of where the difference is very high is the US, where like public schools are just publicly funded, but private schools are basically, the bottom line is that more than 90% of private schools in the US are church-run schools, and this constitution forbids public money going into these type of schools. Which means that basically, like if you are not a public provider, you basically don't get public funding for the schools. And so, how does this type of funding difference matter? I mean, the one thing is, both type of students apparently gain from a more equalized government funding between the two sectors, but the poor kids gain much more than the rich kids. Or put it the other way around, if you look at the inequality in outcomes, this is like 90 points in the front systems and reduced to some 65 points in the back systems. So student outcomes do depend on socioeconomic status everywhere, but to a lesser extent if public funding can go to non-government run schools. What I think this partly says is that actually increasing choices for poor students, because you allow also them to choose into non-publicly run schools, gives them a voice that forces schools to respond to them. So an important aspect here is you have to distinguish funding from operation. And I think at the school level, it's different at the university level, but at the school level, until the end of compulsory schooling, funding is state business. You have to make sure that everybody gets a decent school, and therefore you actually have to cut that off from family background, and so both for equity reasons, but indirectly then actually even for quality reasons, you've got to think about public funding. So in this general sense here, basically in the Netherlands type of system sense, there's something to be said about what might be called like a voucher type funding system where funding follows students. And like in the Netherlands, you can actually then have the funding differ by student characteristics. Jonas also talked about that in Sweden. It's actually easy to do that. It's just you should allow that, you can say a school gets twice as much for an immigrant kid than from a native kid, but That's true both for non-government run schools and for government run schools. And then schools may have an incentive actually to focus on these. But one very important thing, and here I fully again agree with what Jonas has said, and that may be part of the things that going on with Sweden, apart from the point that you don't have information and you don't have accountability, is whenever you allow schools and like non-government schools to pick their own students, you will get cream skimming and you will get high differentiation by socioeconomic background, and that can actually reduce competition to a big extent. So, and I mean, quite innocently, things like queuing time or geographical distance is basically cherry picking by schools. We have to be aware of that. So I think one probably has to go to the radical way of saying whenever a school is oversubscribed, do a lottery. And it's random. That actually gives the poor kids the same chance to get into this school than a rich kid. Ultimately, what you want to have is have the good schools expand, and if there are schools that are bad and parents and students decide I don't want to go there, close them down. That has to happen for the whole system to improve. And that's again the thing that didn't happen in Sweden. And it's probably not easy, of course, but if you really allow funding to follow students, that's what's going to happen. Or actually what you basically see in countries like Netherlands, where they've been having that for about 100 years, is that basically schools get the message when there are fewer applications and they know, Jesus, we have to change something or no one's going to come anymore. So this creates exactly the incentives to do better. But I think to make sure that you don't get equity problems, you have to run lotteries when you're oversubscribed. It's the fairest type of things. And then hopefully next year you can just open another class, and so these good schools do expand. There are experiences of these more specifically around the world. I talked a bit about the Netherlands. There's actually a nice handbook chapter by Eric Bettinger last year, or 2 years ago, on some international experiences, including Sweden, but we got the whole story here. There's been evidence on Colombia, which is more positive, I guess, on aggregate than the Swedish one. Chile is very mixed. It's a bit hard to understand what exactly is going on. More recently, there's been actually been field experiments, randomized field experiments in India increasing, like basically introducing a voucher-type system, which gives somewhat positive results. But I guess the overall story here is it really depends, I mean, most of all, I guess, about the accountability and information that is in the system or not. So just the concluding slide. I think if you do want to improve the long-run performance of an economy, you have to think about the people that inhabit this economy, and you have to just think about what they know and can do. And therefore, it is crucial to look at educational achievement. Just increasing spending per se doesn't ensure that you do get these better outcomes. We have to really make sure that the whole system focuses on outcomes rather than inputs. And in terms of the governance of the school system, I do think that accountability is very important. It can have different disguises, but if you increase autonomy without making schools accountable for what the outcome is, you will probably get exactly what you asked for, namely not student outcomes. And if you've got this type of a system that actually has information on outcomes, then it appears, at least the evidence that I showed you, appears to suggest that actually, yes, choice by parents and competition among schools does work also in the school system, just like it does everywhere else. And on the financing side, I think, I mean, both in terms of quality in general, but also in terms of equity, it's crucial that we focus big time on the public side here. We just have to realize that doesn't mean we want to have public operation everywhere. I mean, it's kind of, that's what we learned in many other areas of economies as well. And the rest I've said. Thanks so much.